Belle Sawyer rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a Tuesday in the spring of 1883, and every man on the main street stopped what he was doing to watch her. She had learned long ago to hold her chin level when men stared. It was a skill she had developed the way some women develop the skill of embroidery or baking out of necessity, practiced until it looked effortless. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair that caught the afternoon light like something that had no business being that beautiful in a frontier town, and green eyes that her late mother had called troublesome, meaning they were the kind of eyes that made a person want to keep looking. She had a straight back and a direct way of carrying herself that some men found exciting for the wrong reasons and other men found unsettling, which suited her fine either way. The staring had been a feature of her life since she was old enough to understand what it meant. In Memphis, where she had grown up, the men had stared from across parlor rooms while pretending to discuss politics. In St. Louis, where she had worked as a seamstress for 2 years after her father died, the men had stared openly, with no pretense at all. And in Abilene, where she had spent the last year trying to establish herself as a dressmaker before the bottom fell out of the cattle business and took half the town's income with it, the cowboys had stared with the particular boldness of men who felt the frontier gave them permission for things that civilized places did not. She had grown tired of being looked at like something on a shelf. Caldwell was supposed to be different. She had a letter in her coat pocket from a woman named Harriet Voss, who operated the only dry goods store in town, and who had written to a dressmakers' association in St. Louis asking if anyone wanted to open a shop in a growing border town. The letter had described Caldwell with the kind of cheerful optimism that border towns always used when they were trying to convince someone to come there. Population growing, new church being built, ladies of some refinement already in residence. The pay from the first 3 months of shop rent would be covered by the town's business council. Belle had read it twice on the train and then a third time on the stage, and each time she had told herself that a fresh start was worth the uncertainty. She tied her horse at the post outside the dry goods store and stepped down from the saddle with the careful dignity of a woman who had been riding for 6 hours and refused to let it show. The main street of Caldwell was unpaved, wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without issue, and lined on both sides with the usual collection of frontier commerce. A saloon with a broken shutter, a barber shop, a hotel with peeling paint on the sign, a land office, a jail with the door standing open, a smithy and Voss dry goods, which had a striped awning that was doing its honest best against the Kansas sun. As she walked to the door, she was aware of the looks. The man sweeping outside the barber shop. 2 cowboys leaning against a water trough. A gentleman in a good hat standing outside the land office who made no effort whatsoever to pretend he was looking at anything else. She set her chin level and kept her eyes on the door of the dry goods store. She almost did not notice the man on the other side of the street. He was standing at the far edge of the smithy's yard, talking to a horse. Not in a showy way, not the way some men talk to horses to demonstrate their rapport with animals for an audience. He was simply standing with his hand on the horse's neck, speaking in a low voice, his attention entirely on the animal in front of him. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair gone a little long beneath his hat. His clothes were clean and worn in equal measure, which was about the best a man could manage in a border town in 1883. He did not look at her. Belle stopped walking. It was such an unusual thing that for a moment she genuinely wondered if he had not noticed her at all. But then she watched as the horse moved and the man shifted his stance, and in the natural course of adjusting his position his gaze swept briefly across the street and she was clearly within it. He saw her, and then he looked back at the horse, just like that, as if she were simply a person walking by and not an occasion. She stood there for 3 full seconds, which was long enough to realize that she was the one staring now, and then she pushed open the door of the dry goods store with something that felt very much like the beginning of curiosity. Harriet Voss was a woman in her late 40s with capable hands and an honest face, and she greeted Belle with the warmth of someone who had genuinely been hoping she would show up. The store smelled of flour and leather and dried herbs, and it had the particular organized density of a place run by a person who believed in usefulness above all else. Harriet walked Belle through the building to a back room that could serve as a workroom, and then upstairs to the 2 rooms above the store that went with the arrangement. "The space is not grand," Harriet said, with the frankness of a woman who had stopped softening things sometime around her 35th year. "But the light from the east window is good in the mornings, which matters for close work, and the town does need a proper dressmaker. Mrs. Alderman has been doing alterations for everyone, but she has 6 children and frankly she looks exhausted." "The space is fine," Belle said, and meant it. It was clean and private, and it was hers, and those things mattered more than grand. She settled in over the following 3 days. She unpacked her sewing tools, her bolts of fabric that had traveled with her in a sturdy trunk, her patterns and her chalk and her measuring tape, and the small framed photograph of her mother that always went on whatever windowsill was available. She hung a small sign outside the shop entrance that Harriet had arranged to be lettered, "Belle Sawyer, dressmaker and alterations." She swept the floor and arranged the display of fabric samples and set out the 3 completed dresses she had brought as examples of her work. On the 4th day, women began to come in. It was not a flood. It was a careful trickle, the way women in a new town always tested a new business before they committed to it. Mrs. Clara Alderman came first, ostensibly to look and actually to assess, and she spent 40 minutes examining the sample dresses with the serious attention of a woman who understood fabric. She left with an order for a new Sunday dress and what Belle recognized as approval, which was worth more than the order. The sheriff's wife came next, and then the school teacher, a brisk young woman named Margaret Hale who wanted a new riding skirt and had strong opinions about the width of the waistband. A rancher's wife rode in from 6 miles out with 2 daughters who needed dresses for a church social. Slowly, day by day, Belle began to feel the first tentative roots of a life taking hold. She learned the town the way newcomers always do, in pieces. She learned that the saloon was called the Silver Spur, and that the owner, a man named Colton Hayes, ran what was widely acknowledged to be a more orderly establishment than most, which in a border town meant the fights were weekly rather than nightly. She learned that the sheriff was a steady man named Elias Prentice, who had held the job for 4 years and had no particular enemies, which was either a sign of his excellent character or his political flexibility, depending on who was telling you. She learned that the church was indeed being built, that the preacher was a thin, earnest man from Ohio who had not yet fully reckoned with the social realities of a Kansas cattle town, and that the town council was composed of 6 men who agreed about very little except their mutual interest in keeping the cattle drives coming through. And she learned, in the natural course of being alive in a small town, that the man at the smithy was named Robert Brenner. She learned this from Harriet, who mentioned him in the way you mentioned a piece of the landscape, simply, as part of describing how things worked. Robert Brenner had come to Caldwell 2 years prior, had bought the smithy from old Hugh Cassidy when Hugh's hands gave out, and had built it into a reliable business with the kind of steady, unhurried competence that made people trust him without quite knowing why. He shoed horses and repaired wagons and made ironwork for the new buildings going up, and on occasion, when a piece of machinery needed more than a cowboy's improvised solution, he was the person who could make it work again. "He is quiet," Harriet said, in the tone of someone offering that as a character reference. "He keeps his own counsel, doesn't drink more than a social drink at the Silver Spur on a Saturday evening. Came from somewhere in Missouri, I think. Never been entirely sure. He doesn't talk much about it." Belle filed this information away the way she filed most things, carefully, without deciding what to do with it yet. She saw him again the following week when Mrs. Alderman's wagon had a wheel come loose on the street outside the dry goods store, and Belle, who happened to be standing at the door watching the morning, was the first person to reach it. She had no expertise in wheels, but she understood the basic mechanics of the problem well enough to know that she could not solve it herself. Several men materialized from the direction of the saloon and offered their opinions loudly and without result. Robert Brenner arrived at a walk from the direction of the smithy, assessed the situation without commentary, crouched beside the wheel, and had the problem diagnosed and temporarily resolved in about 4 minutes, and the wagon rolled to the smithy for proper repair without drama. He did not look at Belle during any of this, which was to say he looked at her exactly as much as he looked at everyone else present briefly, functionally, the way a person takes in a scene before addressing the part of it that requires attention. He thanked Mrs. Alderman for her patience, told the men from the saloon their suggestions had been interesting, and walked back toward the smithy without appearing to notice that half the people on the street were watching him go. Belle watched him too. She was not sure yet what she was looking for. She told herself it was simple curiosity, the natural interest one has in a person who behaves unusually, and it was unusual. She had lived in 4 different towns, and she had never met a man who looked at a beautiful woman the way Robert Brenner looked at the broken wagon wheel, with measured assessment, and then polite indifference once the matter was resolved. She told herself this several times over the following week, with the particular insistence of someone who is aware that they are arguing with themselves. The actual introduction happened at the hardware counter in Voss Dry Goods, which was not a romantic setting, but was an entirely honest one. Belle was there to buy nails for a shelf bracket she was hanging in her workroom, because she had decided that waiting for someone to do it for her was less practical than doing it herself. Robert Brenner was there at the same counter buying wire. Harriet, who was occupied at the other end of the store and was also a woman with social antennae that could detect an introduction opportunity from 30 feet, called out from behind a barrel of cornmeal, "Mr. Brenner, have you met Miss Sawyer? She has taken the shop space on the back side of the building." Robert Brenner turned and looked at Belle with the same quality of attention she had noticed before, direct, unhurried, and entirely without the kind of weight that most men's attention carried. He was closer now than she had been before, and she could see that his eyes were a gray-brown color that was either hazel or something without a good name, and that there were lines at the corners of them that suggested he spent a lot of time squinting in sunlight or a lot of time finding things quietly amusing. She could not yet tell which. "Miss Sawyer," he said, "welcome to Caldwell. I hope the town is treating you well." "It is treating me fine, thank you," she said. "You're the blacksmith." "I am." He said it simply, without the slight defensive edge that some tradesmen carried when the word was stated as a fact rather than a compliment. "Mrs. Alderman told me you saved her wagon last week," Belle said. "The wheel saved itself more or less," he said. "I just gave it direction." Harriet made a sound from behind the barrel that might have been approval or might have been a sneeze. "I am buying nails," Belle said, because this was true and because she suddenly wanted him to know that she was a person who bought her own nails. "For a shelf. Good nails or short nails?" he asked, which was such a practical question, and so entirely unlike the things most men said to her when they were trying to make an impression that she had to recalibrate her expectations of the conversation. "I don't know the difference," she admitted. "Short nails pull out of the wood if you put any weight on the shelf," he said. "For a wall bracket you want at least 2-inch cut nails, and you want to find a stud if the wall is plaster." "The wall is wood," she said. "The room's above this store." "Then 2-inch will do well." He turned to the counter and picked through the small wooden bins of hardware with the ease of someone who did this regularly and set a handful of nails on the counter. "These. And if you need help with the bracket itself, I can look at it. Sometimes the angle of the wall makes the difference between a shelf that holds and one that comes down with everything on it." "I can manage a bracket," she said, a little more firmly than she intended. He did not look offended. "I imagine you can," he said simply. I only meant the offer. Some walls in this building are honest and some are not. Old Hugh put up half of it himself and he wasn't always precise. She looked at him for a moment, testing whether there was condescension in it, and found none. Just information offered without agenda. "Thank you," she said. "I'll let you know if the wall proves dishonest." He almost smiled. She caught it at the edge of his expression, a small, careful thing before it retreated. He paid for his wire, told Harriet good morning, and left. Belle stood at the hardware counter holding her nails and felt, for the first time in a long time, that a conversation with a man had left her feeling more like herself rather than less. The wall, it turned out, was perfectly honest. The bracket went up without any trouble, and the shelf held the folded bolts of trimming fabric without a single complaint. Belle felt a small satisfaction in this that she did not entirely deserve, since Robert Brenner had given her the right nails for it, but she allowed herself the feeling anyway. Spring deepened into summer in Caldwell. The cattle drives began coming through in earnest, which meant the main street filled up with drovers for 2-week stretches and then emptied again. And the Silver Spur did tremendous business on alternating months, and the sheriff earned his salary, and the town breathed the irregular rhythm of a place built on the commerce of animals and land. Belle's shop grew steadily. She made dresses for weddings and church socials, and for the few women who simply wanted something new and could afford it. She made working skirts and mended shirts, and let out the waistbands of things that had been purchased in optimistic moments. She was good at her work, better than good, and the word spread the way word spreads in small towns, quietly, person to person, until it became simply known fact that Belle Sawyer was the person to go to if you wanted it done properly. She was happy, or something close enough to happy that she was not inclined to examine the distance between. She saw Robert Brenner regularly, in the way you see people regularly in a small town, which is to say without great occasion and without being able to avoid it if you wanted to. He came into the dry goods store for supplies. He passed on the street. Occasionally she was at the smithy door picking up a mended pot or a repaired hinge, and he was the one who handed it over with a word about whether the repair had held. They talked. It was not dramatic or urgent or particularly momentous in any individual instance. It was the kind of talking that builds without your noticing, the way a wall goes up from individual stones that are each too small to be remarkable. She noticed that he was kind to the horses that came through his yard, and not in a performed way. She noticed that he kept his tools organized with the precision of someone who respected their work. She noticed that when other men in town talked over each other, he waited, and when he spoke, it was usually the thing that moved the conversation to solid ground. She noticed that he knew the names of all the children in town and spoke to them directly, not in the high, false voice adults sometimes used with children, but just as he spoke to everyone, with the assumption that they were capable of a real exchange. She noticed that he never stared at her. This was the thing that kept coming back to her in the quieter hours of the day, when the shop was closed, and the evening light came through the east window, and she sat with her mending and her thoughts. Every other man in Caldwell had, in one way or another and to varying degrees of obtrusiveness, looked at her the way men looked at women they found remarkable. Some were polite about it, some were not. But even the polite ones had that quality to their attention, that extra weight, that sense that you were being assessed in a particular way that had nothing to do with anything you were actually saying. Robert Brenner talked to her like a person. He looked at her when she was speaking, and when she was not speaking, he looked at whatever was relevant to the conversation, and that was simply it. It was so ordinary, what he did, and yet it was so rare that she had no fully formed word for what she felt about it. She was thinking about this on a Wednesday evening in late June, when Harriet knocked on the door of her upstairs rooms with a plate of supper, and a look that meant Harriet had something to say, and was going to say it whether Belle was ready or not. "I am not one for interfering," Harriet said, setting the plate down and sitting in the chair by the window in the manner of someone very much about to interfere. but you have been in this town for 2.5 months, and I am going to tell you something because I think you are sensible enough to hear it without becoming ridiculous about it." "That is a generous introduction," Belle said. "Robert Brenner is a good man," Harriet said. "A genuinely good man, which is a rare enough thing that it deserves to be said plainly. He came here with not much and he built something honest. He has never cheated anyone in a business dealing. He is fair to every person who comes through that smithy regardless of whether they are a cattle baron or a broke drover. He helped the widow Decker re-roof her house last November and would not take payment for it. He reads, which I mention because in my experience a man who reads is usually trying to understand something, which is a better quality in a person than most." "Harriet," Belle said. "I am not finished," Harriet said. "He has also not courted anyone in the 2 years he has been here, which I can see you already find interesting because you are trying to look like you don't. And I notice he talks to you differently than he talks to most people. Or rather that he talks to you the same way he talks to most people, which given how he usually is with women is actually quite different." Belle looked at the plate of supper. "You should have been a lawyer," she said. "I should have been several things," Harriet said pleasantly. "I am telling you because I think you are lonely in the way that people get lonely when they have been moving for a long time, and I think he is lonely in the same way, and I think two people who are quiet and capable, and both clearly thinking too much about things they are not saying to each other might benefit from the occasional direct word." Belle was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the evening sounds of Caldwell were settling in, the far-off sound from the silver spur, the horses at the livery, the regular small sounds of a town coming down from its daytime energy. "He doesn't stare at me," she said finally, meaning it as the explanation it was. Harriet looked at her with the expression of a woman who understood everything she was not being told. "No," she said. "He doesn't. He is not that kind of man." She stood up. "Eat your supper. I'm not suggesting you do anything hasty. I'm suggesting you perhaps stop being quite so careful about keeping a distance from something that might be worth something." She left. Belle ate her supper and looked out the east window at the evening sky going from gold to deep blue over the Kansas plain, and thought about what it meant to be looked at without being reduced. The summer brought 3 significant events to Caldwell in fairly quick succession. The first was the completion of the new church, which was cause for a community celebration that involved a potluck supper outside on a Saturday evening, with tables set up on the main street and a fiddler from the hotel who turned out to be quite good. The second was a fire at the Mayhew Ranch, 6 miles south of town, which burned the family's barn to the ground without hurting anyone, but left them in a serious situation going into the hay season. The third was a man named Dex Harker, who rode into Caldwell with 3 companions in the last week of July, and made himself unpleasant in the way that a certain kind of man always makes himself unpleasant when he rides into a small town with companions, and a sense that he has more standing than he does. Harker was the foreman for a cattle operation run by a man named Willard Cross, whose spread was north of town, and whose relationship with the town's ranching community was what Harriet described as complicated, which meant Cross owned more land than anyone, and had acquired some of it in ways that the local ranchers had never felt entirely right about but could not prove were dishonest. Harker was the face that Cross put forward when he wanted something made clear. He was a broad man with a small, watchful face, and the kind of smile that does not reach its owner's eyes, and he had been through Caldwell twice before and left a residue of unease each time. Belle encountered him on a Friday morning when he came into her shop with his hat on, which was not a thing men did in women's establishments if they had any manners, and stood in the middle of her workroom looking at her samples with a proprietary air. "I heard there was a dressmaker worth visiting in Caldwell," he said, in the tone of a man who expects to be flattered by this acknowledgment. "I make dresses," Belle said, which was neither modest nor immodest, simply accurate. "If you have someone who needs work done, I can discuss what I can offer." Mr. Cross is having a gathering at his ranch next month, Harker said. He'll want something made for a lady who's coming from Wichita. If the lady can come in for measurements, I can accommodate that, Belle said. I don't work from descriptions. Harker's small smile did not change shape, but something behind it did. You're the new girl, he said, as if clarifying a category. I'm Belle Sawyer, she said. I have been here 3 months and I intend to remain. Plenty of dressmakers have come through this town, he said, pleasantly enough, but the pleasantness was doing a specific kind of work. Some of them stayed, some moved on, depends on whether a town feels hospitable. Belle looked at him steadily. I find it very hospitable, she said. Now, if you'll tell the lady in Wichita to come see me when she arrives, I'll be happy to discuss what she needs. Is there anything else? Harker looked at her for a moment with the look of a man who is deciding whether to push something further, and then he put his hat back on fully and left without another word. Belle stood very still in the middle of the workroom and breathed carefully until the sound of his boots on the boardwalk had passed. She did not mention this to Harriet. She mentioned it to no one. She had dealt with men like Harker before, and her experience had taught her that the best response to casual intimidation was to proceed normally, which she did. But the following evening at the community potluck for the church completion, she found herself standing near the drinks table with a cup of lemonade when Robert Brenner materialized beside her, not in a pointed way, just in the way a person arrives at a place where they want to be. I saw Harker come out of your shop yesterday, he said, without preamble or particular agitation, just a fact he was placing in front of her. He was inquiring about work for Mr. Cross's household, she said. Robert was quiet for a moment. Did he behave himself, he asked. She looked at him sideways. The evening light made everything in Caldwell look better than it was, the unpaved street and the rough buildings gilded into something that almost looked like the town it was trying to become. The fiddler had started up, and several couples were moving toward the open space between the tables. He was not disrespectful, she said. He was simply the kind of man who reminds you that he could be if he chose. Robert nodded slowly. Cross has been making noises about the water rights on the south pasture, he said. Several ranchers are unhappy with him. Harker is his way of making the unhappiness worse. If he comes in again and makes you uncomfortable, I would ask you to tell me. I can manage Mr. Harker, Belle said. I know you can, he said, and he said it with the same straightforward certainty he brought to everything, with no implication that she might not be able to. I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm suggesting that having someone else aware of the situation is useful in a town like this one. She considered this. All right, she said. I'll tell you. They stood side by side with their lemonade and watched the dancing for a while, and then Mrs. Alderman's youngest pulled the tablecloth and there was a brief crisis involving a pie, and somehow in the recovery from that they ended up sitting across from each other at a table, and then sitting there for 2 hours talking about everything and nothing, which is the most important kind of talking. She learned that he had grown up in a town in Missouri where his father ran a general store, and that he had learned ironwork from an uncle who had a smithy outside of Kansas City, and that he had come to Caldwell because it was growing, and because the previous blacksmith was old, and the town needed the work doing properly. He had been to Denver once and found it interesting but too large. He had never been east of the Mississippi since leaving Missouri. He read whenever he could, mostly history and sometimes novels when he could get them, which was difficult in a border town, but not impossible if you were willing to wait for the library wagon that came through 3 times a year. She told him about Memphis and St. Louis and Abilene. She told him about her father, who had been a tailor and who had taught her to take the measure of fabric with her hands as well as her tools. She told him about the particular loneliness of being good at something in a place that needed you but did not know you, the feeling of being useful before being known. I understand that, he said, and she believed that he did. Why did you never, she started, and then stopped. Never what? He asked, not with impatience but with the simple patience of someone who had time for the rest of the sentence. Never mind, she said. He looked at her with that level, unhurried attention. "You can ask me things," he said. "I won't be offended by questions." She thought about it. The fiddler was playing something slower now, and the couples on the dance floor were moving in the easy way of people who have been with each other long enough to not have to think about it. Around them the town was golden and warm, and she felt, in a way she had not felt in a long time, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "Why don't you stare?" she asked. "Most men do." He was quiet for a moment. Not in the way of someone caught out, but in the way of someone giving a question the respect of actual consideration. "Because you're a person," he said finally, "not a view." She looked at him. He was looking at the dancing, not at her, and the simplicity of the answer was such that she almost laughed, not from discomfort but from the relief of it. "That is the most straightforward thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "It's the most straightforward answer," he said. "I don't know that I can improve on it." She looked down at her lemonade and thought that Harriet had been right about several things, and that she was going to need to think about that carefully and probably at length. The barn raising for the Mayhew farm happened on a Saturday in the middle of August, which was the way communities handled disasters in 1883, not with charity but with labor, which was both more practical and more dignified. Half the able-bodied people from the surrounding ranches and from Caldwell itself showed up with tools and food, and the particular collective energy of people who understand that what happens to one of them might happen to any of them. Belle came with Harriet. She was not a carpenter, but she was a capable pair of hands, and she could cook and carry and be useful in the dozen ways that were needed in any large communal effort. She spent the morning helping to organize the food and the afternoon carrying lumber and water, and in between helping Mrs. Mayhew, who was a quiet woman in her 30s with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been frightened and is not yet fully back to herself. Robert Brenner was there from first light, doing the heavy ironwork, the hinges and the brackets and the reinforcing hardware that held the frame together. She saw him periodically through the morning and afternoon, always in the thick of what needed doing, always efficient without being showy about it. He worked with the Mayhew brothers and two of the ranchers from south of town, and a pair of drovers who had come along because word had spread at the Silver Spur, and some men preferred a barn raising to a morning of nothing. Toward the end of the afternoon, when the frame was up and the walls were taking shape, and the mood had shifted from determined work to something closer to satisfaction, Belle found herself sitting on a fence post with a cup of water, and Robert came and leaned against the fence beside her, pushing his hat back with the motion of a man who has been working in the sun for 6 hours and is allowing himself a moment. "Good work," he said, not specifically to her but to the general situation. "The Mayhews will be all right," she agreed. He took the water she offered without ceremony and drank it and handed it back. "This is what towns are supposed to do," he said. "People forget that sometimes. They think a town is the buildings and the commerce. It's the people who will come when something goes wrong." "Memphis was not like this," she said. "Bigger cities aren't. People get strangers about it." "I think you mean strange," he said. "I mean strangers," she said. "Everyone becomes a stranger to everyone else. They stop knowing how to show up." He turned his head and looked at her with that quality she had come to think of as his particular kind of attention, honest and without agenda. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The city?" "I miss the library," she said, "and some of the fabric suppliers. I don't miss much else." He almost smiled again. The near smile was something she had catalogued carefully over the past few months. The way it appeared at the corner of his expression and then retreated, not from reluctance, but from the habit of a man who had been careful for a long time. "I can write to a supplier in Kansas City," he said, "if there's something specific you need. I have a contact there from when I was sourcing equipment for the smithy. He deals in dry goods as well." "You would do that?" she asked. "It's just a letter," he said, and then after a pause, "I like finding ways to be useful." She looked at him in the afternoon light, at the honest planes of his face and the quiet steadiness of him, and thought that she was in considerably more danger than she had admitted to herself. The August gathering at the Cross Ranch happened 3 weeks later, and the woman from Wichita did come in for her dress, and Belle made it beautifully. A green silk worth twice what Harker had offered to pay, and she had charged accordingly, which had produced a brief stiffening negotiation with Harker that she had won by the simple expedient of being entirely willing to decline the commission. She had learned that the best position in any negotiation was genuine indifference to the outcome, and she had genuine indifference to the outcome because she had enough work from the rest of the town that she did not need Willard Cross's money. Harker came back twice more in August. The first time was ostensibly about further alterations to the green dress, which required no further alterations. The second time he brought one of his companions and stood in the doorway of her workroom and talked about the water rights dispute in a way that had nothing to do with water rights and everything to do with making clear that Cross's circle was larger than hers, and that Caldwell operated within certain arrangements that a dressmaker from Memphis might want to understand. Belle was calm both times. She was very good at being calm on the outside while being absolutely furious on the inside, which was a skill that had served her well in multiple situations across her life. She told him she appreciated the information, offered him no opening, and waited until he left. She told Robert that same evening. She had not planned to. She had been walking back from the post office with a letter from her cousin in St. Louis, and she had encountered him at the edge of the smithy yard, which was already becoming a habit. The way their paths crossed at the end of the day with a frequency that was either entirely coincidental or not coincidental at all, and either way she had stopped questioning it. She told him about Harker's visits and the conversation about the water rights, and she watched his expression carefully as she spoke. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Cross is making a move on the Henderson pasture. He's been at it for 6 months. Harker visiting you is his way of telling the town that Cross has reach in every corner. It's not personal to you." "It feels personal," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's why he does it." He looked at her. "I'm going to talk to Sheriff Prentice, not in a way that puts you in the middle of anything. But Prentice should know that Harker is making rounds and what he's saying." "You don't need to do that on my account," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." There was a moment between them that was different from the moments that had come before. She was aware of it, and she was aware that he was aware of it, and neither of them moved to do anything about it, but neither of them moved away from it either. The evening settled around them, warm and dusty and full of the small sounds of a frontier town winding down its day. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You may," she said, and then felt slightly schoolteacherish for the correction. The corner of his mouth moved. "Do you ever go riding in the evenings?" "I sometimes ride out past the south pasture when the work is done. It's good light out there at sundown." She looked at him. "Are you asking me to ride with you?" she said. "Yes," he said, in the direct way he had with everything. "Then you might say so directly," she said. "I'm saying so directly," he said. "I would like to ride with you if you'd be willing." She thought about Harriet, who would be entirely and irritatingly pleased. She thought about the east window and the evening sky and the conversation at the potluck that had gone 2 hours and felt like 20 minutes. She thought about a man who looked at her like a person. "Yes," she said, "I would be willing." They rode together that Friday evening, and then the Friday after that, and then on a Tuesday because neither of them wanted to wait until Friday. The land south of Caldwell opened into wide, flat grassland that was its own kind of beautiful, not the dramatic beauty of mountains or canyons, but the patient beauty of a place that goes on as far as you can see and makes no particular argument about itself. In the evening light it turned gold and amber, and sometimes a rose color that was almost too lovely for the harsh context of the frontier, and Belle understood why he liked it there. They talked on those rides the way they talked everywhere, which was easily and at length and about real things. She told him about her mother, who had died when Belle was 15, and about the particular way grief had shaped her into a person who handled things herself, because handling things herself had been necessary. He told her about a brother in Missouri, younger by 4 years, who was a school teacher and who wrote letters every few months with the kind of careful optimism of a person who is checking on someone without wanting to appear worried. "He worries about you," Belle said. "He is allowed to," Robert said. "I worry about him. That's what brothers do, I think." She thought about the word family and what it meant to people who had moved away from theirs, and whether a person could make the thing again somewhere new, and whether that was something you were allowed to want or whether wanting it made you soft in a way the frontier did not forgive. "Do you think you will stay in Caldwell?" she asked, on an evening in early September when the grass had started to dry and the sky was going through its full repertoire of color. He looked at her steadily. "I think I have more reasons to stay than I did 6 months ago," he said. She let that settle without responding to it directly, which was its own kind of response. On the third Saturday of September, there was a dance at the hotel. The hotel dances were quarterly events that served as the town's primary social occasion outside of church, and they were treated with the seriousness of things that do not happen often enough to be taken lightly. Women wore their best dresses and men made an effort with their boots, and the hotel proprietor, a stout man named Gideon Welsh, laid out a respectable spread and hired the fiddler again plus a man with a squeeze box who played with more enthusiasm than precision, but was cheerful about it. Belle wore a dress she had made for herself, a deep blue wool challis with a simple fitted bodice and a hem she had spent 2 hours perfecting, because she was a dressmaker and her own clothes were a professional statement. She had pinned her hair up with a tortoiseshell comb that had been her mother's, and she had the particular feeling of a woman who knows she looks well and is at peace with that rather than self-conscious about it. Robert came to her door at the time they had arranged, which was the first time he had come to her door at an arranged time, and she registered the significance of that even as she found it exactly right. He had made his own effort, his good hat, his dark coat that had been recently brushed, boots that caught the lamplight. He looked at her when she opened the door with the direct warmth that she had come to understand was his version of the appreciation that other men performed loudly and he felt quietly. "You look very fine," he said. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." They walked to the hotel in the warm September evening, and it was such a simple, ordinary thing, and so exactly what she wanted to be doing that she had to remind herself to breathe normally. The dance was everything a quarterly hotel dance in a frontier town in 1883 could be, which was quite good. The fiddler and the squeeze box player found each other's rhythm in the first hour, and the dancing was lively, and the whole room had the particular warmth of a community gathered for the purpose of enjoying itself, which was not as common as it should be. Belle danced with several people during the evening with Harriet's husband, a quiet farmer named George Voss who danced with dogged cheerfulness, with the sheriff, who was surprisingly graceful, with young Margaret Hale, the schoolteacher, who was determined about the Virginia reel in a way that was impressive. And she danced with Robert. It was a waltz, the second one of the evening, and he asked her with the same directness he used for everything. "Will you dance with me?" Not as a performance and not as an assumption, just a question with an honest answer waiting for it. She said yes, and they moved onto the floor and she discovered that he danced well, not with showmanship, but with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, steady, attentive to her cues, entirely present. She was aware of how close they were in a way that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the fact that she was very much in love with him and had been for some time, and she was only now allowing herself to use that word even in the privacy of her own thoughts. "I have been wanting to say something to you," he said, while they danced. "Then say it," she said. "I think you are the most extraordinary person I have met," he said, in the same tone he used to say everything with the simple gravity of someone who does not say things he does not mean. And I think I have been being very careful and very patient with myself about it, and I am beginning to think that the carefulness and patience are more about fear than virtue." She was quiet for a moment, moving with him through the waltz while the room turned around them. "What are you afraid of?" she asked. "That I'll say it wrong," he said, "that I won't have the words for it." "You always have the words," she said. "You're possibly the most precise person I know." "I'm precise about ironwork," he said. "Feelings are less predictable." She looked up at him. "Tell me what it is," she said. "Precisely." He looked at her steadily, the gray-brown eyes level and honest and without armor. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you since the potluck in June, if I'm honest, and probably before that. I want to court you properly. I want to know if you'll allow that." The music went on around them. Somewhere across the room, the squeeze box player hit a wrong note and corrected himself, and someone laughed. The lamplight made everything warm and golden and soft at the edges. "Robert," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended, "I would very much allow that." The corner of his mouth finally completed what it had been suggesting for months, and he smiled fully, and it was worth every near smile she had catalogued. "Good," he said. "That's good." They danced until the fiddler stopped, and then they stood outside the hotel in the September air while the town settled around them. And she told him that she had known for some time but had been afraid too, because she was a woman who had been moving and she was afraid that what felt solid might not be, and she had not been certain of him. "You can be certain of me," he said. "I know," she said. "I am." He walked her home and said good night at her door with a formality that was both old-fashioned and entirely genuine, and she watched him walk back down the street with the particular feeling of a woman who has something to look forward to. The courtship was quiet and serious and exactly right for both of them. He brought her books from the library wagon when it came through, and she told him what she thought of them honestly, even when she disagreed with his recommendations. And he appreciated the disagreement because a person who tells you what they actually think is worth more than a person who tells you what you want to hear. She came to the smithy sometimes in the late afternoon and sat on the fence and talked with him while he worked, and she found that watching someone work with genuine skill and care was a thing she could do contentedly for a long time. He met Harriet's husband George formally over supper, and they got on well, because both of them were men who preferred to listen before speaking, and who found this quality restful in each other. He drove Belle out to the Henderson farm one Sunday so she could meet the Henderson family, who were among the ranchers most threatened by Willard Cross's water rights maneuverings, and she understood without being told that this was him showing her the full context of the place she had come to, not just the comfortable parts. The water rights situation came to a head in October. Cross had apparently decided that Harker's subtle intimidation was insufficient and moved to a legal filing on the disputed pasture, which brought the Henderson family, two other affected ranchers, and Sheriff Prentice to a meeting in the back room of the dry goods store that Harriet hosted, because it was the largest private room in the commercial district. Belle sat in the corner with her mending and listened to six people argue through the mechanics of a legal situation that was complicated by the fact that the relevant water rights documents were old, partially illegible, and had been filed under two different names due to a clerical error 20 years prior. Robert was at the meeting. He had been there for the Henderson family as a practical support since he had done ironwork for their farm, and he understood the water system because he had built parts of it. He said little during the initial argument, and then, at a point when the voices were getting heated and unproductive, he laid out the simple legal sequence calmly: what they had, what they needed, who they needed to talk to, and the room settled. "We need a lawyer from Wichita," he said. "Not because the case is complicated, but because Cross has one, and a good filing agent against a bad one isn't even a contest." "That costs money," one of the ranchers said. "I'll put in $50, Robert said without drama. "That's a contribution, not a loan. The rest of the town should put in what they can. The water rights matter to everyone who farms south of the creek." Belle looked at him across the room. She had known he was a good man in the way you know things from accumulating evidence, but this was a different kind of knowing. This was watching a person put their resources behind their values in a concrete way, without fanfare, just because it was the right thing. She put down her mending. "I'll put in $15, she said. Several heads turned. "I've been here 7 months and I use the creek water for washing. It concerns me too." There was a brief silence, and then Margaret Hale said she would put in $10, and the barber said 20, and Harriet said she and George would match Robert's 50, and by the end of the evening they had enough for a good lawyer from Wichita. The lawyer came. The filing was made correctly, and Willard Cross's claim to the water rights was denied 3 weeks later by a judge in Wichita who had looked at the actual documents and found them clear once they were properly presented. Cross was furious, but Cross was furious about things fairly regularly, and the town had developed a practical immunity to his fury. Harker stopped coming to Belle's shop. November arrived and brought cold and the particular closeness of a frontier town in winter, when the cattle drive stopped and the pace of life slowed to something more internal. Belle had enough winter sewing work to keep busy. It was the season for heavier garments, coats and wool skirts and things that required real construction. She was warm and busy, and she had Robert, who came every evening when his day's work was done, and sometimes in the morning when he wanted to walk with her to the store, and on Sunday afternoons when they rode if the weather was clear or stayed inside and read if it was not. She had long since stopped wondering what he was afraid of. She knew what he was afraid of the same way she knew what she was afraid of: the impermanence of things, the ease with which good situations become former situations, the particular grief of people who have lost what they loved before. They were careful with each other because they were careful people, and they were also, as November deepened into December, unmistakably and thoroughly in love. On the first Sunday of December, he asked her to marry him, not at the hotel dance or in the middle of a public occasion. He asked her in the late afternoon in the smithy, which had been closed for the Sunday, and which in the low winter light with the cold outside and the residual warmth of the banked forge had the quality of a private world. She had been there for no particular reason except that it was where he was, and he had been working on something at his bench, a small piece of ironwork that was not for any customer, and she had asked what it was and he had handed it to her. It was a ring. Simple, precise, well-made iron with a small raised curve at the center that he had shaped with more care than the rest, and the curve was a leaf, and she turned it in her fingers and felt something settle deep in her chest that had been restless for a long time. "It's iron because that's what I know," he said behind her. "I can get you something else if—" "No," she said immediately. "This is what I want." She turned around. He was standing with his hat in his hands, and his expression had the openness of a man who has stopped being careful, who has decided that being seen fully is worth the risk of it. "I love you," he said. "I want to marry you. I want to build something with you here, something that stays. I know that I'm a blacksmith in a border town, and I know that you have more options than Caldwell, and I know—" "Robert," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes. Yes," she said again. "Yes to everything, to the ring and to Caldwell and to you. Yes." He came forward and took her face in his hands, which were large and steady and warm despite the cold, and he kissed her very carefully, the way a person kisses something they have been keeping safe for a long time. She kissed him back with considerably less carefulness, and considerably more of everything she had been managing for months, and he laughed against her mouth, which was the best sound she had heard in a long time. They were married in February of 1884, in the new church, which was finished, and which the earnest preacher from Ohio had grown into somewhat after a winter in Caldwell had seasoned his expectations of human nature. Harriet sat in the front row and looked openly pleased with herself, which she had every right to. George Voss stood as a witness. Margaret Hale cried, which surprised everyone including Margaret. The Henderson family came from their farm, as did most of the town, because a wedding was not something a frontier town in 1883 took lightly, and also because people liked Robert Brenner and had been wondering for a year when this was going to happen. Belle wore a dress she had made herself, ivory wool with a fine cream lace collar that had come from a supplier in Kansas City, the contact Robert had written to, who had turned out to carry exactly the lace she wanted. The dress was the best thing she had ever made, which was saying something. She carried a small bunch of dried flowers because it was February in Kansas and fresh flowers were not an option, and the dried flowers had been gathered and pressed the previous autumn by Mrs. Mayhew, who had sent them with a note that said simply, "For when you need them." Robert stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle with the same expression he had worn since December, open, steady, hers. He had put on his good coat and his best hat, and someone had persuaded him to get a haircut, and he looked exactly like himself, which was what she loved most about him. The ceremony was simple and quick, and she said her vows in a clear voice without trembling, which she was proud of, and he said his in the same direct way he said everything important, looking at her the whole time, and the preacher pronounced them married, and there was a great deal of noise from the congregation that the preacher seemed to find theologically complicated but sociologically appropriate. They had a supper at the hotel after, a proper wedding supper that the hotel cook outdid herself for, and there was dancing again with the same fiddler who had played the quarterly dance, and it was warm and full, and everything a beginning should be. They went home to the house Robert had arranged. He had bought a lot on the east side of town in October, before he had asked her, and therefore in the particular hope of someone who has decided what they want, and he had spent November and December building, with help from the Mayhew brothers and 2 other men from town who had given their Sundays. It was not large, but it was solid, a proper house, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a back porch, with a room off the kitchen that he had made specifically for her work, with the east window that let in good morning light because he had listened. She stood in the workroom on their first morning and looked at the east window in the February light, and thought about a letter from a woman in Kansas she had read on a train and on a stage and a third time for courage, and the unpredictable generosity of things that happen when you follow the uncertain thing. She thought about all the places she had been, and the way she had always been good at moving but never quite as good at staying, and she thought that staying was the braver thing, and that she was ready for it. Spring came early that year. The cattle drives began again in March, and Caldwell remembered what it was: a living, noisy, commerce-driven border town with mud on the streets and the smell of livestock, and the particular democratic mix of people that the frontier produced, from the established ranchers who had been there since the 60s to the new settlers coming through with everything they owned in a wagon, looking at the prairie and wondering what they had committed to. Belle watched all of it from her shop window and from her front porch and from the back of her horse on the evening rides that she and Robert still took because they had found the thing they liked and they kept it. She was pregnant by June. She knew before she told him, carried it for 2 weeks with the secret warmth of something new, and then told him on an evening when they were sitting on the back porch, watching the last of the light go out of the sky to the west. She told him plainly, in the way she told him everything, and he was quiet for such a long moment that she felt the first edge of worry, and then he turned to look at her, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, not the near smile but the full thing, and something behind it that was so large it had no name, or rather had several names, and love was only the beginning of them. He reached over and took her hand. He held it without speaking for a long time, and the evening went dark around them, and the stars came out over the Kansas plain in the unhurried way of things that have been doing this for a very long time and will go on doing it long after everything else has changed. "Are you pleased?" she asked eventually, because the silence, while clearly happy, was very long. "I am beside myself," he said, with a specificity that she found deeply satisfying. Margaret Hale came to the house the following week with a package of wool flannel for the baby, which she had bought with a calm practicality that was entirely in character. "You'll want to start early," she said. "You won't want to be doing complicated sewing in the last months." "I know how to plan ahead," Belle said. "I know you do," Margaret said. "I'm saying it so I have a reason to sit here for an hour and you have a reason to let me." Belle poured the tea and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about the school and the town and the water rights case, which was fully settled, and the new church that was finally getting its bell tower, and the baby, which Margaret said would clearly be intelligent since both of its parents were, and which Belle said would need to be patient since patience was in short supply in the region generally. The baby was born on the 23rd of February, 1885, exactly 1 year and 1 day after the wedding, which was close enough to the anniversary to produce a family joke that lasted for years. He was a boy. He was born at 7 in the morning when the winter light was just beginning to come through the east window of their bedroom, and he announced himself with the kind of vigorous certainty that suggested he had strong opinions about existing, which Belle found entirely appropriate. Robert held his son with the same careful steadiness he brought to everything, and looked at him with the expression Belle had seen at the potluck in June of 1883, when she had first noticed that this man was looking at her like a person, that quality of full, honest attention without armor or agenda. He directed it at his son, and she saw it, and felt something close to the most happiness she had ever been. They named him James, after Robert's brother, who wrote a letter from Missouri that was so long and so full of exclamation that Belle read it twice, and then wrote back to say that his nephew looked like his uncle, which was possibly the kindest thing she could say because Robert's brother was a handsome man if the small photograph on the mantel was to be believed. The years that followed had the quality of good things built slowly. Belle's shop grew into a proper establishment, busy enough that she took on a young assistant, a 16-year-old girl from one of the farming families south of town named Lucy Graves, who had an instinct for fabric and an eagerness to learn that made Belle's days richer. She taught Lucy everything she knew, because she understood that knowledge shared was knowledge doubled. Robert's smithy expanded. The cattle drives brought increasing traffic and increasing need, and he hired a young man named Tad Ellsworth who was good with horses and willing to learn the metalwork. And together, they kept the smithy, the most reliable operation in the commercial district. He served 1 term on the town council, which he found irritating in most of the ways that elected service is irritating. But he did it because someone had to do it correctly, and he was the kind of man who stepped toward things rather than away from them when the alternative was watching them be done badly. James was 2 when Belle fell pregnant again, and 3 when his sister arrived on a cold November morning with considerably less drama than her brother and considerably more apparent interest in looking around, as if she had opinions about the room and was not ready to commit to them yet. They named her Mary, after Belle's mother, which made Belle cry in a way she had not expected, the good kind of crying that comes from the completion of something. James regarded his sister with the solemn attention of a very small person confronted with a significant development, and then patted her head once with a small hand and went back to his toy horses, which Belle found philosophically mature. Caldwell continued to be Caldwell. The cattle drives went on through the mid-'80s and then began to slow as the railheads moved, and the economics of the range shifted, which was the perpetual condition of the frontier. Everything was always on the edge of becoming something else. The town did not collapse as some towns did. It settled into itself. Some of the rough edges smoothed as the lawless period gave way to something more stable, not entirely stable. Nothing in Kansas was entirely stable, but more so. The silver spur was bought by a man who painted the outside and replaced the broken shutter and started serving food, which was a sign. Willard Cross sold his northern land holdings in 1887 and moved to Denver, which surprised no one who had been paying attention to the pattern of his business dealings. Harker went with him, and the town exhaled collectively in the way it does when a low-grade source of tension removes itself. The Henderson family bought back the pasture that had been in dispute at a fair price, and the water rights were never challenged again. Belle's shop was, by 1888, the most established dressmakers in a two-county area. Women came from other towns. She had expanded into the adjacent storefront when it became available, which gave her proper space for a fitting room and a display area, and a workroom where Lucy, now 20, ran the day-to-day alterations with the confidence of someone who has been trusted with responsibility and has risen to it. Belle designed the more elaborate pieces herself, the wedding dresses, the formal gowns for the women of means who were beginning to appear as the town's better class solidified. She had a reputation, and the reputation had been earned stitch by stitch over 5 years, and she was proud of it in the way you are proud of something that took a long time and real labor. She was 30 in 1889, which was something she contemplated with the honest attention of a woman who does not shy from facts. She had a life that was full in every direction: her work, her husband, her children, her town, her friend Harriet, who was as central to her daily existence as bread and considerably more enjoyable. She had roots, which was the word she used when she thought about it. Roots meaning the kind of belonging that means you leave traces when you are gone and would be missed if you moved. And that was not nothing. That was the opposite of nothing. Robert turned 34 that year, and Belle made him a new coat from a dark brown wool she had specially ordered from Kansas City, with a lining she had quilted herself in the evenings over 2 months. He put it on and stood in the kitchen and turned around once, and then he looked at her with the expression she knew best: steady, warm, hers. "You spent too much time on this," he said. "I spent exactly the right amount of time," she said. He came to her and kissed her in the kitchen in the way married people kiss, which is different from the way they kissed in the smithy in 1883, not because it is less, but because it is more layered, because it has the whole accumulated weight of everything that has been built together, and that weight is not a burden but a foundation. "I love you," he said, against her hair. "I know," she said. "I have always known." James was 4 years old and deeply interested in horses, which was almost certainly Robert's fault for taking him to the smithy too young. Mary was almost 2 and had developed a habit of collecting small stones and presenting them to people as gifts, which Belle found charming and Robert found endearing and James found baffling. The house had grown with them. Robert had added a room the previous year, properly built with good plank walls and a window that faced the morning, because the house he had built in 1884 had been built for 2 people, and they were now 4, and the mathematics required attention. On the morning of their 5th anniversary, Belle came downstairs in the gray light before the children woke and found Robert already in the kitchen with the stove going and coffee made, which was the thing he did sometimes when he had been awake earlier than she had and did not want to wake her. He handed her the coffee without ceremony, and they stood at the kitchen window and watched the light come up over the Kansas plain. 5 years, she said. 5 years, he agreed. She thought about the woman who had ridden into Caldwell on a Tuesday in the spring of 1883, chin level, green eyes straight ahead, carrying the experience of a life in motion, and the weariness of being looked at the wrong way for a long time. She thought about the moment she had stopped on the boardwalk outside the dry goods store, because a man across the street was not looking at her, and the way that absence of a thing had felt like the presence of something else entirely. She had married him partly for that, for the remarkable, simple, revolutionary fact of being treated like a person in an age and place where that was not something a woman could take for granted. She had married him because a man who would not reduce her to a view was a man who would not reduce her at all, who would see the whole of her and want the whole of her and ask directly what she wanted. And she had married him mostly for everything else, for the patience and the honesty and the near smile that became a real one, for the way he listened before he spoke and meant what he said when he did. For the iron ring and the east window and the letter to the supplier in Kansas City. For the $50 at the town meeting, and the barn raising, and the evenings on the south pasture in the good light. For the way he held their son, and the way he looked at her from across a room, and the way he said, "I love you," not often but always true. For the man himself, fully and entirely, which was the mostly. "James is going to want to see the horses today," she said, coming back to the morning. "James always wants to see the horses," Robert said. "We could take them both out to the Henderson farm," she said. "Elizabeth Henderson wrote last week about the new foal. James has been asking." "I know," he said. "He asked me every day this week with what I can only describe as a formal campaign." Belle laughed. "He gets that from you." "He certainly does not," Robert said, with the exact trace of amusement that she had learned to read as his version of being delighted. They finished their coffee, and the house woke up around them, which was its own particular pleasure. The sound of James's feet on the floor upstairs and Mary's voice beginning its morning commentary on the state of her world. The small sounds of a life that had been built carefully and was now simply being lived. Harriet came by in the afternoon with George and a cake, because Harriet marked anniversaries with the seriousness of a person who understood that the things worth having were worth celebrating. They sat on the back porch, all of them, while the children ran in the yard, and the late spring afternoon unfolded with the unhurried generosity of a day that knows it is good. "Well," Harriet said, looking at Belle with the expression of a woman who had been right about something and was only mentioning it by implication. 5 years. 5 years, Belle said. "I said he was a good man," Harriet said. "You did," Belle agreed. "You were entirely correct." "I usually am," Harriet said, and ate her cake with great satisfaction. Robert was sitting with George across the porch, talking about the land prices south of the creek, which was what men in Kansas always talked about eventually, and Belle watched him and thought about all the ways you could know a person, by how they behave when something is broken and when something is built, by what they choose and what they give up, by the small moments of an ordinary day that accumulate over years into something indistinguishable from a life. She knew him entirely. She trusted him entirely. She loved him in the easy, settled, everyday way that is not the bright urgency of the beginning, but is better is the thing the bright urgency is trying to become. He must have felt her looking because he turned, and across the porch in the late afternoon light he looked at her with those gray-brown eyes that had never stared, that had only ever seen. She smiled at him. He smiled back. The full version, no near about it. Caldwell went on being Caldwell, and Belle went on being Belle Sawyer, which was her name before and her name still. The Brenner added as an accumulation rather than a replacement, because she was not the kind of woman who disappeared into a name any more than she was the kind of woman who disappeared into a room. She was present and known and here, in this border town in Kansas with its unpaved streets and its occasional drama and its very good light in the evenings, and she was home. The children grew. James at 5 could name 20 breeds of horse and was beginning to show his father's precision with his hands, building small, careful structures out of wood scraps in the smithy yard while Robert worked. Mary at 3 had graduated from gifting stones to gifting flowers, a development everyone agreed was an improvement, and had Belle's directness and Robert's patience in a combination that promised to be formidable in about 15 years. Belle's business continued to thrive into the next decade. She trained 2 more young women after Lucy, creating a small legacy of craft in the region that outlasted the wildest days of the cattle drives and settled into the quieter commerce of a maturing frontier. She wrote to her cousin in St. Louis twice a year, and to Robert's brother James in Missouri, and the letters came back full and warm, full of the news of lives being lived in other places, which made the world feel appropriately large without making Caldwell feel small. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, in February of 1894, Robert took her back to the smithy. It was closed and banked, as it had been the evening he asked her, and the winter light through the high windows was the same low gold it always was at that hour, and the smell of the forge and the iron was as much home to her now as the east window of her workroom. He gave her something wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it to find a bracelet, iron, worked with the same care as the ring he had made 10 years before. The surface was not smooth, but textured with a pattern she had to look at twice before she understood it. Small leaves, dozens of them, worked into the metal with a precision that must have taken him weeks. "It was a leaf on the ring," she said. "I had more room this time," he said. She put it on and held out her wrist and looked at it and then at him, and felt the full weight of 10 years and everything they had been to each other in them. She had cried at very few moments in their marriage. She was not a woman who cried easily, but she felt the pressure of it behind her eyes now and did not entirely suppress it. "Robert," she said. "I know," he said. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said again and smiled. "I have always known." She laughed, because it was her own words back to her, and he laughed with her, and the smithy that had been the backdrop of the beginning of them held the sound of it the way old walls hold warmth, keeping it against the cold outside. They walked home together in the February evening. Through the town that was theirs in the way, a place belongs to the people who have helped make it what it is, and the stars were out over the Kansas plain, and the house was warm with the fire Robert had banked before he came for her, and their children were asleep in their beds, and the east window was dark with the good coming morning, and it was not perfect, because nothing is, and it was not simple, because nothing worth having is simple, but it was theirs. Solid and built and lasting, and that was more than enough. It was everything.